In the modern academic discourse about mind and body, there are two dominant theories called mind-body dualism and mind-body identity. The mind-body dualism theory says that mind and body are two different things comprised of two different ingredients. Dualism was formally created by René Descartes to give a philosophical foundation for doing science separate from the practice of religion. Prior to Descartes, the church claimed that the Bible contained all the truths, and whatever was not contained in the Bible was untrue. Christianity did not allow people to study the world because it was claimed that there was nothing new to be found outside the Bible. Descartes wanted to change that. He created the mind-body dualism to say that the truths given in the Bible only apply to the mind, while the truths of the body were not given in the Bible. Hence, studying the body was not contradictory to the Bible. Rather, religion was the study of the mind and science was the study of the body. These two kinds of studies were mutually complementary, Descartes claimed. The division of reality into mind and body then led to the separation of natural law and moral law. The Bible was the moral law, and the inquiry into the nature of the world would lead to the discovery of the natural law. The mind body dualism was thus created to get away from the hegemony of the church and to pave the way for the development of science. Of course, dualisms are not new in Western philosophy. There is a long history of dualisms in Western thinking that continues to this day. These dualisms include being versus becoming, form versus substance, theoretical versus practical, rationalism versus empiricism, essence versus existence, public versus private, normative versus descriptive, individual versus collective, structure versus function, and so on. None of these dualisms till date have been solved. That is because we need both sides of the dualism, but we cannot combine them into a single logically consistent theory. One side of the dualism is incomplete, and both sides of the dualism are inconsistent. The mind body dualism is yet another enduring inconsistency. In the 20th century, it became evident that the mind body dualism is false. Mental illnesses were often caused by brain injury. Thoughts and sensations were found to trigger electrical activity in the brain, and electrical probes that injected currents in the brain led to thoughts and sensations. Therefore, the inability to reconcile the opposite sides of the dualism and the empirical evidence against it led to the theory of mind body identity. In this theory, the mind was just the byproduct of the electrical currents in the brain. Mind and body were now compared to water molecules and fluidity. The brain was like water molecules and the mind was like fluidity. Scientists claim that this will solve the problem. However, the idea that the mind is an epiphenomenon of the molecules in the brain has been a scientific failure because nobody can explain how the epiphenomena is produced. There is no way to create sensations, thoughts, reasoning, emotions, intentions, and morals from molecules. The molecules are studied as quantities, while our experience is described as qualities such as color, smell, taste, emotions, and so on. There is no bridge between the quantity and the quality descriptions. This is presently called the hard problem of consciousness. It should actually be called the impossible problem of consciousness because qualities follow non-binary logic, whereas quantities follow binary logic. Simple properties of arithmetic addition don't apply to qualities. Therefore, calling it the hard problem instead of the impossible problem is misleading. In Vedic philosophy, both mind and body are described in terms of qualities. The interaction between mind and body is interaction between qualities. Hence, the problems of Cartesian dualism don't arise. However, mind and body are two different kinds of qualities. Therefore, mind and body are not identical. Thereby, the mind and body are neither mutually identical nor totally independent. I shall call this theory a mind body non dualism to contrast it to the mind body dualism and mind body identity theories. In this video, we will discuss what this non dualism is. Before we move forward, it is worth noting that there are still many people who believe in a mind body dualism. Some of them postulate that the mind is like software and the body is like hardware. Of course, this does not solve the problem of transforming quantities into qualities. The software always deals in quantities and never in qualities. Computational theories of the mind show that it is possible to have mind body dualism without solving the problem of quantities and qualities. There is only one solution to this problem, which is that both mind and body must be qualities. The solution to the mind body problem requires us to redefine the body as qualities rather than quantities. This is hugely problematic because it undermines the whole of modern science based on quantification, mathematics, and measurement. Therefore, the only solution to the mind body problem is not pursued because it requires us going back to a time when Descartes had not created the mind body dualism, not claimed the separation of religion and science, and not asserted that the body was to be studied mathematically. Quantification via instrument measurements was justified in the early days of science based on the problem of subjectivity. For instance, two observers don't always agree on their perceptions, even if they are perceiving the same thing. They may be looking at an apple and they might perceive the color, smell, or taste differently. Science claimed that subjective experiences cannot be objective truth and replaced observers with instruments. However, that did not solve the problem because even instruments measure different values for the same property and the same thing. In science, these are called instrument errors. Sometimes they are attributed to a changing environment. Thus, observer subjectivity is replaced by instrument and environment variance. The problem of variation between observations does not disappear by instrumentation. Factually, the idea of an objective world doesn't come from precise agreement between different observers or instruments. It comes from the fact that we can agree within a ballpark about what the world is. Even as mathematics is precise, nothing in the world precisely follows mathematics. For instance, there are no perfect triangles, squares, or circles. Mathematics is at best a good approximation of reality. Therefore, we need to redefine subjectivity and objectivity consistent with the facts that have led to these notions. To do this, we can take the example of a pen. Ideally, it is a pen. Non-ideally, it can be a weapon, toy, or ornament. However, it can never be a car, airplane, or satellite. Therefore, pen, weapon, toy, and ornament are subjective or personal truths, while not being a car, airplane, or satellite are objective or universal truths. The objective truth is true for everyone. That the pen is not a car is true for everyone. The subjective truth is true for someone. That the pen is a toy is true for someone. The objective truth cannot be equated to what the world is because there are many possible interpretations. All these interpreters can only agree to what the world is not. Therefore, objectivity equals negative truths which everyone can agree on. With this redefinition of subjective and objective, they become mutually complementary because they deal with what something can be and can never be. The objective reality is impossibility and the subjective reality is possibility. The pen can never be a car. That is an objective truth for all observers. However, the pen can be a toy or weapon for some observers. That is subjective truth for some observers. Similarly, red can never be yellow, blue, or green. That is an objective truth for all observers. But red can sometimes be crimson or scarlet. That is a subjective truth for some observers. The subjective and objective are not separate substances. Rather, they correspond to the positive and negative claims. We can summarize this by saying that the mind is positive claims while the body is negative claims. For example, the mind is a positive claim like this is a pen, while the body is a negative claim like this is not a car. By mind, we simply mean something that may be true for one person. By body, we simply mean that which is true for everyone. The difference is simply that we have a choice in case of the positive claims, but no choice in case of negative claims. When we define mind and body as positive and negative claims, then they are neither identical nor completely different. The correct word for mind and body is underdetermination. It means that if we know the body, we can say what the mind cannot be, but we cannot say what the mind will be. Likewise, if we know the mind, we can say what the body will not be, but we cannot say what the body will be. This is mutual underdetermination of positive and negative claims. We can know the mind by the body and the body by the mind within a ballpark. In this scenario, mind and body are both qualities rather than quantities. They are also possibility and impossibility, so they cannot be identical. Mind and body are also not independent truths. Positive and negative claims are true of the same thing. However, the positive claims can exist without the negative claims, but the negative claims cannot exist without the positive claims. The negative claims can be made only after the positive claims. Hence, the mind can exist disembodied, but the body cannot exist without a mind. Wherever there is a body, there must be a mind. Let's apply this idea to neuroscience. Suppose an instrument measures electrical activity in the visual cortex of the brain. By that measurement, we can say that the subject could not be experiencing some colors, shapes, sizes, etc. We can rule out certain types of perceptions. However, we cannot say what precise color, shape, and size the subject is experiencing. Similarly, if a subject reports having a certain type of visual sensation, we can rule out certain types of brain activities, but we cannot say what precise activity there will be in the brain. The brain underdetermines the mind, and the mind underdetermines the brain. They are neither separate realities nor identical realities. The brain gives us negative claims, while the mind gives us positive claims. Hence, both mind body identity and mind body dualism are false. There are two mutually inseparable realities. The correct term for two inseparable realities is non dualism. It is neither identity nor dualism. Hence, we can call this brain mind non dualism. This mind-body discussion can be generalized into a theory of counting, which involves three steps of distinguishing, identifying, and sequencing. Let's illustrate it by an example of counting two animals, one a cow and the other a horse. Before we can count two things, we must know each thing, such as a cow or a horse. This requires us to know the traits of horses and cows, which are the positive claims about the cow and the horse. However, to distinguish the cow and horse, we must know what their traits are not, which lead to a cow is not a horse and a horse is not a cow. These are the negative claims. Finally, to count, we must sequence the horse and the cow and call them first and second. After we have distinguished two things, identified each thing, and then sequenced them as first and second, then we get the number 2. Therefore, a theory of counting, which is called Sankhya in the Vedic text, depends on three distinct steps. The mind is the positive claims, which we call identifying. The body is the negative claims, which we call distinguishing. Finally, there is an unconscious mind, which we will discuss shortly, which is responsible for sequencing. To do this sequencing, we have to say that the cow is better or superior than the horse. That's how cow will be first and horse will be second. Generally, our perception begins with the body, proceeds to the mind, and then proceeds to the unconscious mind. Thereby, we distinguish things, then identify each thing, and then sequence those things as better or worse. However, from the perspective of a theory of counting, the criteria for what is better and what is worse comes first. The various criteria for identifying things as cow or horse come next, and the criteria to distinguish a cow from a horse comes last. To rationally construct the world, we have to go from the sequencing criteria to the identifying criteria to the distinguishing criteria. But to observe this world, we generally go from distinguishing to identifying to sequencing. In simple words, the perception of reality is the reverse of the construction of reality. An easy example of mind body difference is seen in various types of learning, such as music. Some people are born with a musical ability even if they cannot play any instrument at that time. The musical ability generally means the capacity to produce melodies and rhythms. But even those with musical ability cannot produce melodies and rhythms on instruments right at birth. As they learn to play instruments, their brains are modified, and the melodies and rhythms that were previously in the mind are now translated into an instrumental performance. In some cases, the musical ability grows with the instrument playing, but that ability existed even before the person knew how to play an instrument. The instrument playing ability is in the body. At birth, it exists as a disability to play instruments. As a child grows and learns to play instruments, the disability reduces. The reduction in disability appears to be just like an increase in ability. But these are not identical because the person had musical ability even when he or she did not know how to play any instrument. Likewise, as one practices music, the mental ability can also increase. Thus, as time passes, often the capacity to create new melodies and rhythms grows just as the fluency with the playing of an instrument. However, many people are experts in playing instruments but cannot produce new melodies and rhythms. They have bodily ability acquired through instrument practice, but they have no mental musical ability. They can play pre existing songs, but they cannot produce new songs. If mind and body were identical, then those with instrument abilities must be prolific music creators, and those who don't know how to play instruments should not be able to create music. Both are false. Prolific musicians are not always prolific instrumentalists, and vice versa. This point about mind body difference is further seen in the Vedic description of species. As we have seen, there are three definitions of an individual based on the body, the mind, and the unconscious mind. The body defines what a species is not. The mind defines what the species is. Finally, the unconscious mind defines a hierarchy of species, or which species is superior or inferior to the other species. It means that a human body is not always the human species. A human body with a dog's mind is mostly a dog, although due to his human body he may not be able to do all that a dog is able to do. Since the body and mind mutually underdetermine each other, therefore changes to the body are not necessarily changes to the mind. The mind defines what a species is. Hence, bodily changes don't always mean a new species. Due to environmental conditions, the same mind can develop into a different body. Modern evolutionary theory calls that a new species. That is mostly false because body changes simply give us the ability to distinguish things rather than to identify them. To call a different body a different species is equating the distinguishing to identifying. That is a false equality. The body is distinguishing and the mind is identifying. We know that tables can be three-legged or four-legged. Chairs can be with or without a backrest or armrest. They are still called tables and chairs. The three and four-leggedness is distinguishing, but calling it a table is identifying. The presence of backrest and armrest is distinguishing, but calling it a chair is identifying. The chair and table can also be called a ladder in some cases without adding anything to them. This is how concepts and percepts underdetermine each other. The mind body mutual underdetermination is the same underlying principle. It means that even if two bodies look different, if they are mentally similar, then they are the same species. If they are mentally different but bodily similar, then they are different species. In short, we define a species based on what something is rather than based on what it is not. Philosophers of language in the West have claimed that the word meaning association is arbitrary. As Shakespeare said, a rose by another name would smell as sweet. This is a false claim due to two important reasons. First, there is the problem of phonosemantics in which similar meanings have similar sounds. For example, the sound stra denotes something long and thin. It appears in English language in words such as string, strap, street, straight, straw, strip, strand, stream, strung, etc., all of which mean something long and thin. Second, there is a problem of a language being concise and precise. If word meaning associations are arbitrary, then a language will never be concise and precise. To be precise, we will have to use many words. If we reduce the number of words, then the resulting descriptions will not be precise. In the Vedic philosophy of language, there is a system of sounds in which all meanings can be expressed precisely and concisely. In this language, we can communicate the greatest amount of information through the shortest number of sounds compared to any other language. We can also communicate everything that can ever be perceived, conceived, intended, felt, and so on. Language and experience must be completely congruous. If this congruity is false, then there is something that cannot be known or communicated in language. But if there is congruity between language and reality, then we can talk about reality itself as language. Reality is now not physical things, it is words. This philosophy of language is further associated with the discussion of rituals. Having already established the congruity between reality and a complete, precise, and concise language, a ritual is any activity by which we change reality. The most prominent type of ritual is that which utters words, which are called mantras. By uttering sounds in the precise and concise language, we can change the reality. This word meaning philosophy can be applied to the mind body problem. The body is words and the mind is meanings. However, a word doesn't have a fixed meaning. It can be interpreted in many ways. That doesn't mean it can be interpreted arbitrarily. The word sound simply tells us what the meaning cannot be. The meaning, the mind then interprets the sound as one of the many possible meanings. In this process, we must use the ideal, the possible, and the impossible triad. For example, we must say that a word can never mean certain things, that it could possibly mean certain other things, but ideally, for the current time, place, situation, and person, it only means just one thing. Of course, in practice, we may not always arrive at the ideal interpretation. Therefore, we have to add more words and sentences to eliminate the non ideal interpretations. We have to remember that the job of the words is to say what the meaning is not. By adding words, we eliminate non ideal meanings. The Vedanta Sutra applies this principle to Veda and states that the Vedic texts should be interpreted collectively and not individually. We can give a false interpretation to one word, one sentence, or even one text. But if all the texts are interpreted collectively, then the interpretation will be ideal. As an example, we cannot interpret Upanishads in isolation. We have to interpret Upanishad, Purana, Itihasa, Tantra, Samhita, and Darshana collectively. In isolation, one text can give us a false interpretation, but collectively, all texts will eliminate false interpretations. The same principle can be applied to knowing someone's mind. For example, the mind is not fully known during the childhood. It is known more during teenage. It is known even more during youth. And it is known even more during old age. We have to see a person across stages to know who they are completely. One interpretation at one stage can be false. Over time, the false interpretations will be eliminated. The negative notion of the body can now be equated to the body being words because a word simply tells us what the meaning is not. Similarly, the body tells us what the mind is not. It doesn't tell us what the mind is. Any attempt at mind body identity is false because the positive doesn't equal the negative. Likewise, any attempt at mind body dualism is false because they underdetermine each other. We will now discuss the Vedic theory of body, mind, and the unconscious mind. The essence of this theory is that the unconscious mind is the basic reality from which the conscious mind is projected outward. From this mind, the body is projected outward. The situation is just like dreaming, in which the unconscious mind generates thoughts and sensations, which include the sensation of having a body. The waking state is just like the dreaming state, although during the waking stage, one observer interacts with the other observers. That interaction, however, does not give us the true state of the external reality because each person is conditioned by a different unconscious mind, conscious mind, and the body. Due to this projection, both body and mind comprise qualities. There is no mind body interaction problem because both are qualities. However, they are not the same type of qualities because the conscious mind is the positive claims and the body is the negative claims. The development of the body after the birth is the acquisition of more distinctions between the self and the other. For example, when a child is born, it makes fewer and coarse grained distinctions between itself and the world. As the child grows, it can make more and finer distinctions between itself and the world. For instance, newborn children do not make the distinctions of gender, race, language, religion, or nations. All these distinctions develop over time. The capacity to make finer distinctions also increases the capacity to make finer identifications. A good example of environmental influence on the body is exposure to traumatic experiences during childhood. They get embedded in the body, and the body becomes habituated to anxiety and overstimulation, leading to numerous health problems. Likewise, if a child receives nurture and love during childhood, these too are embedded in the body, and the body becomes habitually calm and relaxed. The mind is largely one's nature, and the body is largely one's nurture. We are born with a mind and we acquire a body. Due to underdetermination of body and mind, inherent and acquired traits mutually influence each other. They are neither mutually identical nor mutually independent. Sankhya philosophy talks about three kinds of bodies called subtle, gendered, and gross. In a Western terminology, the gross body is what everybody calls the body. The gendered body is what everyone calls the mind. And the subtle body is what everyone calls the unconscious mind. There are many divisions within these categories, but we will not go there for now. The key point is that there is neither mind body duality nor mind body identity. There is no duality because all three bodies are constructed from three basic qualities called the three guna or prakriti. There is no identity because there are indeed three different types of bodies. The relation between these bodies is neither identity nor independence. Prior to these three kinds of bodies, there is a soul, and the three kinds of bodies are successive coverings of the soul. These three coverings of the soul allow us to count the souls by distinguishing, identifying, and sequencing. The souls are distinguished by the gross body, identified by the gendered body, and sequenced by the subtle body. These three types of bodies keep changing. Hence, the number assigned to each soul also keeps changing. The escape from a changing identity to an eternal identity is the goal of life. Thus, the main purpose of Sankhya is to establish how a temporary identity is created, how one can go from inferior to superior temporary identities, and then how to go to the eternal identity. We can contrast this to the Western mind body dualism, in which the body is mathematical while the mind is qualitative or non mathematical. We can never reconcile these two into a single theory. There is no mechanism by which they can interact. There is no explanation of how a quantitative reality becomes a qualitative reality or vice versa. Attempts to solve the problems of this dualism lead us to the mind body identity. Now, the body is mathematical and the mind is a qualitative epiphenomena of the body. Still, nobody can explain how quantity produces the qualitative phenomena. The mind body dualism is now replaced by the so called hard problem of consciousness. As we have discussed, the problem is not just hard, it is impossible. Qualities and quantities follow different systems of logic. Laws of arithmetic don't apply to qualities. Therefore, the mind body problem would never be solved without abandoning the Cartesian system of quantifying the body. Western mind body thinking is often married to Abrahamic ideas in which the soul, just has one life. There is identity change in this life, but nothing after this life. When the soul is discarded in a materialistic system of philosophy, then identity is also reduced to the body. However, since the body keeps changing, therefore there is no identity persistence, even in this life. It means that if you bought a house during your youth, the house no longer belongs to you in the old age because the identity is the body which has already changed. The person who bought the house no longer exists, so the house is also no longer owned. Similarly, marriage, parenthood, citizenship, employment, and every other type of relationship between the self and the other becomes non persistent because the self is nothing more than a changing body. Since such a society could never exist in practice, therefore nobody can live without a persistent soul. The existence of the soul is an absolute cornerstone of any kind of society. Mind body identity is only a speculative and academic theory that can never be implemented in the real world. In Sankhya philosophy, the gross body is called Bhuta. Surprisingly, the same word is used for ghost and past. The past exists as a cause, but we cannot see the cause. We infer the presence of the past by its effects. The ghost exists as a cause, but we cannot see it. We infer the presence of the ghost by its effects. In the same way, the gross body exists as a cause, but we cannot see it. We infer the presence of the gross body by its effects. In karma philosophy, if I have done bad things in the past, then bad things will happen to me in the present or future. However, the definition of good and bad is personal and is called guna. I can change my definition of good or bad. The past karma will eliminate good things and enforce bad things according to my definition of good and bad. Therefore, the past underdetermines the present and future because it only decides whether good or bad will happen and not my definition of good and bad. We cannot see the past, but by its good or bad effects, we must infer that this is happening due to a past. Otherwise, the effects would be called random and we would not be able to explain why bad things are happening or how to bring about a better future. But if I accept that past is a cause, then I can find ways to do good things to create a better future. The gross body is just like the past. It can determine what our observations will not be, but it cannot determine what our observations will be. Based on our guna, which condition the mind, the same gross body will result in different subjective experiences. For example, some people may consider white skin beautiful, while others may consider black skin beautiful. Even our sensations can be different. That is because the body underdetermines the mind. The mind is restricted by the body and yet not fixed into one state. Choice still plays a role in interpretation. The subtle, gendered, and gross bodies are also called the deep sleep, dreaming, and waking states of the soul. The deep sleep is the unconscious mind, the dreaming is the conscious mind, and the waking is the body. The mind body distinction now becomes the distinction between dreaming and waking. The dreaming state can be thinking, sensation, action, emotion, intention, and relation. But it is all within the mind. Even if we are oppressed in our dream, the person oppressing us is a creation of our mind and not a real external oppressor. The waking state is just like the dreaming state because everything we see during waking can also be seen during dreaming. Therefore, some Indian philosophers say that the world is just a dream. It requires that we are the only consciousness without a distinction to others. The problem with this claim is that if we were the only consciousness, then we should be in full control of our dream and never suffer. We should just have pleasant dreams rather than unhappy dreams. The existence of painful experiences refutes the idea of a single consciousness. The waking experience is that in which others play a role in our experience. The core characteristic of waking is a causal role for another actor. This is not easy to detect, but it can be detected because causal interaction is like a message with a sender, receiver, and content. The content of the dream and the waking can be the same, but the sender of the dream is the self and the sender of waking is another actor. Such detection is not possible in case of physical properties. For example, it is impossible to tell in physics whether the light entering our eyes is coming from the sun, the distant stars, or the bulb in the room because there is no sender address in the photon. Then again, photonic theory cannot explain why we dream with our eyes closed. Therefore, it is essential to say that there is a source address, a receiver address, and content. The source is the same as the receiver in the dream, and they are different in waking. The source can be known whenever there is an experience. The necessity of otherness in the waking experience brings in the objective body as negative truths. The brain says reality is not a thick, long, and heavy scissor. The mind says reality is a thin, short, light pen. The former is objective truth and the latter is subjective truth. It means that everyone can agree that reality is not a thick, long, and heavy scissor, but some people might say that it is a toy instead of a pen. Infinite other things are negated in a toy or a pen, but only some of those will be represented in the brain to narrow down the choice. Something that is not a scissor could be infinite other things, but the mind will narrow those down to just one thing. This narrowing is personal and not universal. As a person becomes learned, he needs to eliminate more possibilities to narrow down the choice to just one thing. An ignorant person narrows down the choice quickly. Thereby, the ignorant person comes to a conclusion quickly, whereas the learned person comes to a conclusion slowly. Hence, the brain of a learned person is more complex to represent more eliminations. A less learned person's brain is rather simple. We have to treat the brain as words and sentences rather than particles and their properties. Then we have to treat the brain as negative truths rather than positive truths. Those negative truths are simply words, and the positive truths are their meanings. Reality constrains choice but does not eliminate choice. Reality is not free for all. It is also not just one thing. There is objective truth without that truth being just one. One truth is the ideal truth. Other truths can be proven and hence cannot be denied. However, we can agree that one of those truths is the best truth. The negative truths are never observed. However, they can be inferred from the observations. For example, we can infer that what we observe as an apple is not a guava or a nectarine. But this contrast is not universal. In tropical countries where guavas grow, we will say that an apple is not a guava. In cold countries where nectarines grow, we will say that an apple is not a nectarine. Thereby, even as an apple is not guava and nectarine is a universal truth, it is not necessarily invoked or used in all places. Rather, according to the climate, part of the universal truth is invoked. This is the contextualization of the universal truth. According to time, place, and situation, some negation is invoked. Similarly, even as one thing can be many things, it is not always all the things. One out of the many is chosen in each time, place, and situation. The rest are negated by inference. We see this often in the use of words which can have many meanings. For example, the word president can mean a person or a class. However, when we say that the president wants to meet you, then we infer that the word only means the person and not the class. A temporary negation is added to the word contextually. Similarly, if we use a pen as a toy, a temporary negation of "it is not a pen" is added contextually. Thus, mind and body are tightly correlated, but they are neither mutually identical nor mutually independent. Whatever has been negated is not observed, and yet it can be inferred. The inference is sometimes called neti neti in the Vedic system, which means not this and not that. It constrains or limits what the reality or truth could be, and yet it doesn't fix the truth or reality. Observation and inference are therefore complementary modes of knowing. By inference, we can only know what is not true, but not what is true. This problem is seen in indeterministic physical theories, where we can rule out many possibilities, but we cannot precisely say what will happen. For instance, if we apply the law of conservation of energy to the world, we can say that outcomes that don't conserve energy won't happen. But we cannot say which of the many possible outcomes that conserve the energy will happen. We need observation to know what actually happens. Underlying Western thinking is a Greek idea of universalism. It claims that there is only one truth and everything else is false. Universalism searches for one scientific theory that will explain the whole of reality. Universalism tries to globalize itself, calling everything else false and evil. A universalist tries to shape the world in its image. Universalism despises variety and diversity and espouses uniformity and singularity. However, universalism is false. No two apples are alike, no two people are alike, no two places or times are alike. Reality is infinite variety which cannot be subsumed to one truth. If we try to do that, then we will have to destroy variety. That destruction will lead to conflicts in which both sides will be destroyed and nothing will be left. Therefore, universalism always entails nihilism. People try to universalize their idea, enter into conflicts with others, which destroys both sides, and the result is nothingness. Universalism and nihilism entail each other. There is another conception of truth in the Vedic text, which is a ladder. The top of the ladder is the supreme truth or the best ideal perfect truth. However, the lower rungs of the ladder are progressively worse truths. Nothing is absolutely false, there is some truth in everything. The situation is just like a pen. The pen is the ideal, complete, and perfect truth. A toy, weapon, or ornament are progressively worse truths, but they are not false. Even saying that a pen is not a car is not false. It is a negative truth, and yet a truth. It is an inferior, non ideal, and imperfect truth. Thus, the truth ladder can also be divided into three parts, namely, the ideal truth, the possible truths, and the impossible truths. A lie is only the untruth which arises by elevating the negative truth to the positive truth. The lie can never be verified, however, it can be falsified. When there are infinite truths rather than one truth, then we have to use both verification and falsification. If there was only one truth and everything else was false, then we could just use verification for that one truth and everything else would be falsified automatically. But if there are infinite truths, then we have to employ both verification and falsification. The truths are verified and the lies are falsified. By verification, we know what the truth is, and by falsification, we know what the truth is not. These complementary methods mutually define each other. That is, when lies are falsified, the truth is restricted but not known precisely. When the truth is verified, the lies are restricted but not known precisely. Thus, in the Vedic texts, the twofold method of knowledge is used. For example, the Bhagavad Gita states, Na sato vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate sataha, ubhayorapi drishyontas tu anyos tattvadarshibhi. It means that the lies don't exist in knowledge and the truth is not absent in knowledge. By seeing the nature of both, we know the nature of each. We can illustrate this by the example of a pen. The truth is pen. However, the pen can also be a toy. Asserting that there is a pen is not an automatic denial of everything other than pen. We have to individually assert or deny everything. That happens when we say that the pen is also a toy, but not a car. The toyness is verified and the carness is falsified. The process of knowledge involves both verification and falsification. They are like M.C. Escher's artwork of two hands drawing each other. The verification hand limits the falsification hand, and the falsification hand limits the verification hand. They are mutually defined and mutually underdetermined. We cannot say that verification and falsification are independent. We cannot say that these two are identical. Western thinking assumes that we can know the true nature of the world based on axiomatic reasoning. The axioms of the theory pertain to one fixed reality. Both of these are false assumptions. Reality is one ideal, many possible, and many impossible things. Nothing is just one thing. Reasoning or inference applies to what something is not rather than what it is. When we axiomatize that reality is just one thing, we make two mistakes. One, we eliminate the role of choice in interpreting reality. Two, we apply reasoning to what reality is rather than what it is not. Both of these mean that the axiomatic theory will be indeterministic. That is because all axiomatic systems are false. Everything created based on the method of axiomatization and inference will work in some cases and not in other cases. That is because reality is not axioms and inference. The correct model of reality is possible, impossible, and choice. Reality is not one thing, it is many possible and impossible things. We can choose one of the many possible things, but never the impossible things. We also cannot observe the impossible, although it exists objectively. Its existence can be inferred rationally from the possible, and its impossibility can be proven by contradiction, such as by establishing the failure to achieve the impossible. The proof by contradiction is rationally definitive. The proof by observation is empirically definitive. The axiomatic method instead relies on two kinds of rationality called induction and deduction, both of which are problematic. Induction is problematic because we can never establish that if X is seen many times, it will always be seen. The deductive logic simply takes the inductive inference as truth and tries to deduce the outcomes deterministically. However, no axiomatic system has ever worked because there is a choice. What has happened many times need not happen again. It also need not have happened in the past. Choice undermines both induction and deduction. Induction is false because it need not have happened in the past. Deduction is false because it will not always happen in the future. It just happened a few times. The axiomatic system universalized that occurrence and concluded that it always happened in the past and it will always happen in the future. Logic cannot eliminate choice. If that is what logic does, then it is a false logic. The determinism that follows in logic is also false. Of course, choice is not free will because we cannot choose freely and arbitrarily. Our choices are constrained by reality. Thus, the dualism of choice and determinism is also false. Reality is not deterministic. We have choices. Choices are not free, they are constrained. In the choice, possibility, and impossibility system, we have inference of negative truths from positive truths. We are not relying on X happening many times to infer that it will always happen. We are simply relying on one observation to say what cannot happen, what can happen, and what could happen won't happen unless there is a choice. Logical inference is not deterministic due to choice. Choices are further constrained due to laws of responsibility. Apart from could and would, there are constraints of should. What could happen should not happen. But if it would happen, then there are laws of responsibilities. But we will not go into that right now as it will take us away from our current focus. Mind body non dualism can be summarized simply as the sequence from ideal to possible to impossible. The ideal is not necessarily the universal ideal, it is just a personal ideal. Once the ideal is known, we can infer many possibilities from which we can infer the impossibilities. Let's take the pen as an example again. Ideally, it is a pen. However, non ideally, it could also be a weapon, toy, or ornament. The non ideal relies on some parts of the whole truth. For example, a pen requires that it must have an ink chamber. But the weapon, toy, and ornament uses of the pen don't need an ink chamber. Therefore, the non-ideal uses of the pen overlook the presence of one of its parts, namely the ink chamber. The ideal use of a pen requires all its parts to be present. The ideal description of the pen is therefore also the most complete description. All other descriptions are partial or incomplete. Therefore, if we know the ideal and complete description, then we can derive partial descriptions rationally. Similarly, once we know the partial truths, we can derive the untruths which will never be true. We will never see these untruths because what we see is always our perception, which is some ideal or non-ideal truth. However, the untruths can always be inferred. Even when they are observed, they are not what we are observing because there is a choice in interpreting reality. The untruth limits the choice but doesn't fix it. We can now conclude that the unconscious mind is the whole truth, the conscious mind is the partial truth, and the body is untruths. We can also say that the unconscious mind is all the possibilities, the conscious mind is some of the possibilities, and the body is the impossibilities. For example, I can dream that I am flying in the air, but my body will not allow it during waking. The mind has the imaginative power of flying, but the body is incapable of flying. Similarly, I can imagine that I can be at many places at once, but my body won't allow it. The body fixes me in one place. I can imagine knowing the past or future, but the body fixes me at the present. I can imagine that I could be a dog or a demigod, but my body prevents it. I can imagine that I am the ruler of the whole world and have access to all the pleasures, but my body doesn't allow it. The body is therefore a disability on the mind. It restricts the mind. It is a reality check for the mind. It is a bondage on the mind that limits the mind. The mind is freed from the bondage of the body while dreaming. However, even that dreaming is limited by the unconscious mind. Therefore, in the Vedic text, the three bodies are simply considered bondage, and the goal of life is to become free of bondage. The bondage is a limitation on the capacities of the soul. The freedom from bondage is removing the unconscious mind, the conscious mind, and the body to recover the native capacities of the soul. The three bodies are external to the soul, the soul's innate capacities are internal to the soul. This is how science is connected to religion in the Vedic tradition. The study of the body tells us that it is a limitation on the mind. The study of the mind tells us it is a limitation on the unconscious mind. The study of the unconscious mind tells us that it is a limitation on the soul. This education ends materialism through the study of matter. It establishes the meaning and purpose of life, which transcends this life. All problems of modern thinking began with Christianity when it claimed to know all the truths. That was false. Not only were there numerous truths not in the Bible, but some of the biblical claims contradicted observation and reasoning. But the church forbade people from trying to know the truth outside the Bible. This led Descartes to create the mind body dualism. He claimed that the dominion of the church and Bible was only the mind, and that science was about the body. Even this mind body dualism was false. It was false empirically because mental causes create bodily changes and vice versa. It was false rationally because nobody can explain how the mind and body interact. Therefore, in the 20th century, people created mind body identity. They claim that mind and body are identical and that matter is the only reality. Even this is a false claim because matter is described as quantities and it cannot explain the qualitative experience. Finally, materialism fails because all mathematical laws are incomplete and contradictory to other laws. We cannot defer to one law always, and we cannot reconcile the contradictory laws into a single law. The root cause of this failure is that nature is qualities which come in opposites, and the opposites are mutually exclusive. Each opposite is useful in some situation, but not always useful. If we have a common purpose, then we can choose one opposite in one case. But modern science doesn't allow purpose and choice. Therefore, it cannot reconcile the opposites, nor can it unite the opposites by a purpose. 2000 years have elapsed in these false claims. Most people cannot imagine that all this time was wasted. It's personally insulting and demeaning for people born into cultures that uphold these ideologies. Many people have their pride and prestige attached to these ideas. These ideas give solace and comfort to some people. Of course, they cannot justify the pride or comfort rationally or empirically. Therefore, they preserve the false claims dogmatically, which means against rational and empirical evidence. Sometimes they claim that nobody knows the truth, which is also false, only to continue what they have been doing in the past, which means extending and elaborating the false claims. The Vedic system invites everyone to study the truth rationally and observationally. It involves critically examining the meaning of subjective and objective, observation and inference, word and meaning, verification and falsification, distinguishing, identifying and sequencing, the ideal, the possible and the impossible, the experiences of waking, dreaming, deep sleep and the self, and how science and religion are intimately connected rather than disconnected. Even as we speak about Vedic theories, we can establish each theory rationally and observationally. The mind body duality and mind body identity are false claims. They can be easily disproved and they have been disproved, and yet they persist not due to evidence but despite contrary evidence. The truth that can be established rationally and observationally is mind body non duality. And yet, the truth cannot be forced due to choice. However, if falsehoods are chosen, then the journey to the truth becomes much longer.